Doctor! Get away from my father! Security! He's trying to kill him!
The young woman screamed so convincingly that everyone in the hospital froze. Within seconds, security officers rushed into the room and forced the black doctor against the wall in handcuffs. Only moments earlier, he had risked everything to save the 82-year-old billionaire after catching someone secretly disconnecting his life support equipment. No one believed him. The hospital suspended him. The media called him a monster. The billionaire's own daughter stood before cameras in tears, playing the role of the loving child. But there was one thing she never realized. The man lying silently in that hospital bed wasn't as helpless as he appeared. He remembered exactly whose hands had tried to end his life. Instead of exposing her immediately, he and the disgraced doctor made a dangerous decision. Because sometimes the only way to catch evil is to let it walk willingly into its own trap. The cold rain swept across Manhattan, turning the glowing streets of New York into mirrors of silver and black beneath the city lights. High above the restless traffic, the private Helix Medical Center stood like a fortress of wealth and prestige, where only the nation's most influential figures could afford treatment. Inside the intensive care unit on the top floor lay 82-year-old billionaire Edward Ashford, the legendary founder of Ashford Global Holdings. Though age had carved deep lines across his weathered face, Edward still possessed the sharp jawline and distinguished features that had once intimidated boardrooms around the world. His neatly combed silver hair rested against the hospital pillow, and his trimmed white beard gave him the appearance of an aging statesman rather than a fragile patient. Decades earlier, he had built his fortune from a single shipping company after losing both parents in poverty, an experience that made him believe wealth should always serve people rather than control them. Now, after suffering a serious stroke, the once powerful businessman remained unconscious, relying on modern machines to keep him alive. Every afternoon, television cameras captured the arrival of Edward's only child, Victoria Ashford, a 46-year-old woman celebrated by financial magazines as the graceful future of the Ashford empire. She was tall and elegant, with long honey-blonde hair flowing neatly over expensive designer coats, striking blue eyes that seemed warm before a camera, and flawless fair skin untouched by worry. Her polished smile and gentle voice convinced millions that she was a devoted daughter who refused to leave her father's side. Nurses admired her kindness in public, reporters praised her loyalty, and social media overflowed with photographs of her holding her father's hand. Only Victoria knew that every smile had become another performance. For nearly a year, Edward's attorneys had delayed transferring control of the company, insisting that the billionaire recover before signing any permanent legal documents. As weeks turned into months, Victoria's patience slowly dissolved into resentment. Behind closed doors, she no longer saw the elderly man as her father. She saw a signature that refused to appear and a fortune that remained just beyond her reach. On the opposite end of the hospital worked Dr. Marcus Bennett, a 43-year-old African-American critical care physician respected by both patients and colleagues for his calm judgment during impossible situations. Marcus stood over 6 feet tall with an athletic build shaped by years of discipline rather than vanity. His deep brown skin contrasted against his crisp white physician's coat, while neatly trimmed black hair and a short, carefully groomed beard framed thoughtful dark eyes that rarely showed panic. Growing up in a struggling neighborhood in Baltimore, Marcus had watched his own father die because a hospital lacked resources to treat him in time. That loss had become the reason he dedicated his life to protecting every patient placed under his care, regardless of wealth or status. Late that evening, the hospital grew unusually quiet. Visiting hours had ended, the corridors emptied, and only the distant rhythm of medical monitors echoed through the intensive care floor. Rain continued striking the enormous glass windows as Marcus finished reviewing laboratory reports before making one final round through the ICU. As he approached Edward Ashford's suite, something caught his attention. The room lights remained dim, but through the narrow glass panel beside the door, he noticed Victoria standing unusually close to the life support equipment. Instead of looking at her father, her eyes remained fixed on the breathing machine. Slowly, carefully, she slipped on a pair of thin medical gloves from a nearby cabinet. Marcus frowned. Family members had no reason to touch that equipment. Before he could process what he was seeing, Victoria reached toward the ventilator tubing with both hands. Then she disconnected it. Within seconds, warning alarms began flashing across the monitor as Edward's oxygen levels dropped rapidly. Marcus burst through the door. "What are you doing?" he shouted. Victoria jumped backward, pretending to panic, while Marcus immediately reconnected the tubing and began emergency intervention. His hands moved with practiced precision, restoring airflow as nurses rushed into the room after hearing the alarms. One nurse began preparing emergency medication while another called the hospital's rapid response team. For several terrifying moments, Edward's heartbeat became dangerously unstable. Then, gradually, the monitor steadied. Marcus released a slow breath, never taking his eyes off the elderly patient. He had made it. Edward Ashford was still alive. But before Marcus could explain what he had witnessed, Victoria suddenly let out a piercing scream that echoed through the entire intensive care unit. "Help!" she cried, tears instantly filling her eyes. "Dr. Bennett disconnected my father's ventilator. I saw him trying to kill my father." Every head turned toward Marcus. The nurses froze. Security officers sprinted into the room as reporters waiting downstairs began noticing unusual activity inside the hospital's executive wing. Marcus stared at Victoria in stunned silence. Only seconds ago he had saved a man's life. Now, he realized someone had already prepared a story in which he would become the villain. Within minutes, the intensive care unit was filled with hospital administrators, security officers, and frightened nurses trying to understand what had happened. Victoria collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably as television reporters gathering in the hospital lobby quickly received anonymous tips, claiming that a physician had nearly caused the death of one of America's most influential billionaires. To everyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than a devastated daughter who had barely witnessed her father survive a terrible medical mistake. Marcus stood quietly while security escorted him from the room. He made no attempt to resist. Daniel Harper, a 58-year-old white hospital security director with broad shoulders, short gray hair, and decades of law enforcement experience, respected Marcus deeply but was obligated to follow hospital protocol until the investigation was complete. As cameras flashed outside the executive wing, Daniel lowered his voice and said, "I'm sorry, doctor, but I have no choice." An hour later, Evelyn Brooks, the hospital's 60-year-old chief executive officer, entered the emergency boardroom. She was a composed African-American woman with short silver hair, intelligent brown eyes, and a reputation for protecting the hospital's integrity above all else. After reviewing the initial reports and facing mounting pressure from the Ashford family's legal team, she reluctantly announced that Dr. Marcus Bennett would be placed on immediate administrative suspension pending a full investigation. News spread across New York before sunrise. Headlines questioned whether one of the city's most respected physicians had committed an unforgivable act. Television commentators speculated, social media exploded with accusations, and Marcus's 20-year reputation seemed to disappear overnight. As he quietly emptied his locker, several nurses looked away, uncertain what to believe. Marcus carefully folded his white coat over one arm before walking toward the hospital exit. Reporters shouted questions from behind the barricades, but he never slowed his pace. Finally, one journalist called out, "Dr. Bennett, are you worried you've just lost your career?" Marcus stopped for the first time. He turned calmly toward the cameras, his expression filled with disappointment rather than fear. "I don't care if I lose my job," he said. "I only want to know why a daughter would want her own father dead." Without saying another word, he walked into the cold New York rain, leaving the question hanging in the silence as the cameras continued to roll. A week later, a pale winter sun struggled to break through the gray clouds hanging over New York City. The freezing wind outside Helix Medical Center seemed to mirror the uncertainty growing inside its walls, where rumors had spread faster than facts. Against every expectation, Edward Ashford slowly regained consciousness. The first face he saw was his daughter's. Victoria immediately leaned over his bed, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling gently across one shoulder as tears rolled down her cheeks. She squeezed his hand with practiced tenderness, whispering, "Dad, thank God you're awake. I was so afraid I'd lose you." Edward's tired blue eyes rested on her face. Then they drifted toward the ventilator beside his bed. A sudden flash of memory pierced through the fog clouding his mind. A pair of gloved hands, the sound of oxygen alarms, a calm voice shouting for help. He remembered everything, not every detail from the stroke, not every conversation before it. But he remembered the exact moment someone disconnected his breathing tube, and he remembered whose hands had done it. His heart broke far more deeply than his body ever had. Still, Edward showed nothing. Instead, he frowned slightly and spoke with the weak, uncertain voice everyone expected from a stroke survivor. "I'm having trouble remembering." Victoria's expression relaxed almost instantly. The fear hidden behind her eyes disappeared. Doctors explained that partial memory loss was common after severe neurological trauma, and she eagerly embraced the explanation. For the next several days, she became the image of the perfect daughter once again. Television crews captured her arriving with flowers every morning. She thanked nurses, comforted visitors, and smiled gently whenever cameras were nearby. Hospital employees admired her devotion. Edward quietly watched every performance. Each smile looked rehearsed. Each tear appeared at exactly the right moment. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Bennett refused to accept the story everyone else believed. Although suspended from active duty, he spent long hours inside his modest apartment surrounded by medical textbooks, legal notes, and copies of every document he had been allowed to obtain before leaving the hospital. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. One detail refused to leave his mind. Modern ventilators automatically recorded every alarm, every adjustment, and every interruption in airflow. When Marcus carefully reviewed the maintenance records that had already become part of the hospital's preliminary report, he noticed something impossible. The activity log covering nearly 6 minutes during Edward Ashford's emergency had vanished completely. Medical equipment did not simply erase its own history. Someone had removed it. That discovery transformed Marcus's frustration into determination. If someone deleted those records, he whispered to himself, they were never trying to hide a mistake. He stared at the screen for several seconds. They were hiding a crime. On the 8th morning after regaining consciousness, Edward quietly asked one of the senior nurses to contact someone he trusted completely. Late that afternoon, Jonathan Pierce, Edward's longtime personal attorney, entered the hospital through a private entrance. Jonathan was a 65-year-old white attorney with neatly combed silver hair, sharp gray eyes, and an understated navy suit that reflected decades of quiet professionalism rather than wealth. Having represented Edward for nearly 30 years, he had earned a reputation for absolute loyalty and never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. Edward waited until every visitor had left before speaking. "There is one man I need you to find," he said softly. Jonathan leaned closer. The doctor they blamed. Edward's voice remained weak, but his eyes had become unmistakably clear. "He saved my life, and someone tried to make sure no one would ever believe him." 2 evenings later, long after visiting hours had ended, Jonathan Pierce quietly escorted Marcus through a private service entrance rarely used by the public. The hospital corridors were nearly silent except for the distant beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of the overnight nursing staff. Every precaution had been taken to ensure no reporters, employees, or members of the Ashford family would notice the meeting. Marcus entered the private suite with mixed emotions. Only a week earlier, he had stood in the same room as the accused. Now he stood there as the only man the patient wished to see. Edward slowly turned his head toward him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, the elderly billionaire extended a trembling hand. "You saved my life," Edward said quietly, "and I repaid you by allowing the world to believe you tried to take it." Marcus gently shook his hand. "You owed me nothing," he replied. "You were unconscious." Edward's tired eyes remained fixed on the doctor. "I wasn't unconscious for everything." The room fell silent again. "I remember the alarms," Edward continued. "I remember someone removing my breathing tube, and I remember seeing my daughter's face before everything went dark." Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, not out of surprise but relief. "I knew I wasn't imagining it," he said softly. Edward nodded. "But if we accuse her now, she'll deny everything. My attorneys have no proof. The hospital has no proof. The only evidence is our memory." Marcus stepped toward the window overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. "Not anymore." He explained everything he had discovered since his suspension. The missing ventilator activity logs, the unexplained deletion of electronic records, and the suspicious gaps in the hospital system history. None of it proved attempted murder by itself, but together they revealed that someone had deliberately erased evidence. Edward listened carefully. "You kept investigating," he said. Marcus smiled faintly. "I became a doctor because I believe every life deserves the truth. Losing my job doesn't change that." For the first time since awakening, Edward allowed himself a genuine smile. "I spent 60 years building companies," he said. "I've learned something about people." Marcus looked back toward him. Greed rarely stops after one victory. Edward slowly nodded. "If Victoria believes I remember nothing, she'll become careless." The two men exchanged a long glance. Neither needed to say the rest aloud. Jonathan, who had remained quietly beside the door throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "If we're going to expose her, we cannot act emotionally. Everything must be legal. Every step must be documented." Marcus agreed immediately. "No shortcuts." Edward added in a calm voice, "From tomorrow onward, I will continue pretending to be confused. She must believe the stroke left me too weak to question anything." "And I'll continue looking for evidence," Marcus replied. "Real evidence. Something no jury, no lawyer, and no television camera can ignore." Jonathan closed the folder he had been carrying. "Then beginning tonight," he said, "the three of us stop reacting." He looked first at Edward. "Mr. Ashford, you remain the helpless patient." Then toward Marcus. "Dr. Bennett, you become the man nobody notices." Finally, he lowered his voice. "And we let the guilty person believe she's already won." Outside, the winter wind swept across the lights of Manhattan as Victoria smiled confidently for another waiting group of reporters. Convinced her greatest obstacle had already been removed. She never imagined that, hidden behind the quiet walls of the hospital she believed she controlled, the father she had betrayed and the doctor she had framed had just become allies. Neither of them wanted revenge. They wanted the truth. And before long, they intended to make sure it could never be hidden again. A bitter wind swept through New York as another week began, carrying sheets of freezing rain against the towering windows of Helix Medical Center. Beneath the city's endless noise, an invisible battle had already begun. One fought not with weapons, but with patience, evidence, and deception. Although officially suspended, Marcus Bennett refused to disappear. Every morning he left his apartment carrying nothing more than a worn leather briefcase filled with notes, medical journals, and copies of publicly available hospital records. To the outside world, he looked like a physician trying to rebuild a shattered career. In reality, he had become something far different. A man determined to uncover every missing piece of the truth. His first breakthrough came from the hospital's digital infrastructure. Ryan Collins, a 38-year-old hospital systems engineer, had spent nearly 15 years maintaining Helix Medical Center's secure network. Tall and lean with sandy brown hair, rectangular glasses, and a quiet personality, Ryan preferred computers to conversations. Years earlier, a ransomware attack had nearly crippled another hospital where he worked, costing several patients access to life-saving equipment. Since then, he had become obsessive about preserving electronic records and backup systems. Marcus met Ryan in a small coffee shop several blocks away from the hospital. "I can't give you confidential patient information," Ryan said cautiously, glancing around the nearly empty cafe. "But I can tell you something that doesn't make sense." He opened his laptop. When someone deletes surveillance footage inside the hospital, the video itself may disappear, but the central server still records who logged into the system. Marcus leaned closer. Ryan pointed towards several highlighted entries. Someone accessed the ICU security archive less than 20 minutes after the emergency involving Mr. Ashford. Marcus studied the screen. "The administrator account?" Ryan nodded slowly. "And that account is supposed to require executive authorization." Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken. So whoever erased those recordings wasn't covering up an accident. They were covering up someone's actions. The discovery confirmed what Marcus had suspected from the beginning. The video might be gone, but proof that someone intentionally destroyed evidence still existed. Meanwhile, another unexpected witness struggled with her conscience. Emily Carter, a 26-year-old intensive care nurse, had joined Helix Medical Center less than a year earlier. She was petite, with chestnut brown hair tied neatly into a bun, soft hazel eyes, and a naturally gentle personality that often made elderly patients feel at ease. Nursing had been her lifelong dream after watching her grandmother battle cancer, but her lack of experience left her intimidated by wealthy families and powerful administrators. Ever since Edward's medical emergency, Emily had barely slept. She kept replaying one image in her mind. Just before the alarms sounded, she had walked past the partially opened ICU door and briefly noticed Victoria standing beside the medical equipment. For only a second, Emily thought she saw a syringe tucked into Victoria's coat pocket, a syringe unlike anything scheduled for Edward's treatment that evening. At the time, fear convinced her she must have imagined it. Now she wasn't so certain. When Marcus quietly requested a meeting through Jonathan Pierce, Emily almost refused. "I don't want trouble," she whispered after arriving at Jonathan's private law office. Marcus smiled gently. "I'm not asking you to accuse anyone." He slid a notebook across the table. "I'm only asking you to tell the truth about what you remember." Emily stared silently at the notebook. For several moments, neither Marcus nor Jonathan spoke. Finally, tears filled the young nurse's eyes. "I saw her," she admitted, "only for a second. But she wasn't standing near Mr. Ashford." She looked down at her trembling hands. She was standing beside the machines. Marcus exchanged a quiet glance with Jonathan. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. As evening settled over Manhattan, Marcus walked alone beneath the cold rain, realizing that the case was no longer built on instinct alone. Electronic records, system access logs, and eyewitness testimony were beginning to point in the same direction. For the first time since losing his medical privileges, hope outweighed uncertainty. And somewhere inside Helix Medical Center, Edward Ashford continued playing the role of a confused old man, waiting patiently for the moment his daughter would make one mistake too many. The following morning, a thin layer of snow covered the sidewalks outside Helix Medical Center, while inside the executive wing everything appeared peaceful. Edward Ashford sat quietly beside the window wrapped in a gray cashmere blanket, looking every bit like an aging billionaire whose strength was fading with each passing day. In reality, every slow movement and every confused expression had become part of a carefully rehearsed performance. Victoria noticed the change immediately. She entered carrying fresh flowers and her usual warm smile. "Good morning, Dad," she said softly as she kissed his forehead. Edward looked at her with tired eyes before forcing a weak smile. "I've been thinking about the future," he whispered. Victoria leaned closer. "My lawyers want me to sign one final version of my will." She remained perfectly still, but her heartbeat quickened. Edward lowered his head as though struggling to gather enough strength to continue. "I don't think I have much time left." The sentence struck Victoria exactly as he intended. She reached for his hand, pretending to fight back tears. "Please don't say that. You're getting stronger every day." Edward smiled faintly. "I wish that were true." Standing near the doorway, Jonathan Pierce silently observed the conversation without interrupting. Every word had been discussed beforehand, yet hearing Edward speak them aloud still carried enormous emotional weight. If Victoria believed her father's health was rapidly declining, greed would almost certainly overcome patience. Later that afternoon, Jonathan met privately with Marcus Bennett and Evelyn Brooks inside a secure conference room away from the hospital's public areas. Evelyn had spent days reviewing internal policies before finally agreeing to Marcus's proposal. "I can't authorize anything illegal," she said firmly, "but if Mr. Ashford voluntarily requests additional security inside his own room, we have every right to protect both the patient and the hospital." Marcus nodded. "That's all we need." Within hours, a specialized security team installed a discreet independent recording system authorized by Edward himself. Unlike the hospital's standard surveillance network, the new cameras stored encrypted footage on a protected external server that could not be accessed through the hospital's administrative accounts. Only Marcus, Jonathan, Evelyn, and the lead detective assigned to the investigation knew the system even existed. Meanwhile, Victoria grew increasingly confident. She noticed her father becoming weaker each day, eating less, sleeping longer, and speaking as though he were preparing for the end of his life. To her, every symptom confirmed what she desperately wanted to believe. If Edward died naturally before changing his mind again, the Ashford empire would finally become hers. That evening, she made a phone call from the hospital parking garage, carefully checking that no one was nearby. "It has to happen soon," she whispered. "There can't be another mistake." She ended the call almost immediately. From a distance, Marcus watched through the windshield of Jonathan's parked sedan. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he recognized the expression on her face. It wasn't grief, it was urgency. When he returned to Edward's room later that night, the billionaire looked toward him with quiet determination. "Do you think she'll try again?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Yes." Edward closed his eyes for a moment. "I never imagined I'd have to fear my own child." Marcus pulled a chair beside the bed. "You don't have to face this alone anymore." The elderly billionaire slowly opened his eyes again. "Then we wait," Marcus nodded. "We wait." Outside, the snow continued falling across Manhattan while Victoria stood alone beneath the hospital lights, convinced that fortune was finally within reach. She had no idea that every decision she made from that moment forward would be observed by people who already knew the truth. For the first time since the nightmare began, Marcus realized they were no longer chasing a criminal. They were waiting for one to reveal herself. Snow drifted quietly across the streets of Manhattan, softening the city's endless noise beneath a blanket of white. Inside Helix Medical Center, however, the silence carried a different weight, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Shortly after midnight, Victoria Ashford stepped out of the elevator and into the executive intensive care wing. Her elegant black wool coat concealed a pair of thin medical gloves tucked inside one pocket, while her polished heels made almost no sound against the gleaming marble floor. The warmth that had filled her smile before television cameras was gone, replaced by cold determination. She paused outside her father's private suite. The hallway was empty. Only the steady hum of air conditioning and the distant rhythm of heart monitors echoed through the corridor. Victoria slowly looked left, then right. Satisfied that no nurses or security officers were nearby, she slipped on the gloves one finger at a time before quietly pushing open the door. Edward Ashford appeared exactly as he had for days. The elderly billionaire lay motionless beneath a light gray blanket, his breathing slow and shallow, his eyes closed as though exhaustion had finally overcome him. Moonlight filtered through the enormous windows behind the bed, casting long shadows across the room. Victoria walked closer. "So this is how it ends," she whispered. She rested one hand gently against the bed rail, waiting several seconds to ensure there was no movement. Then she turned toward the ventilator. Her gloved fingers reached for the breathing tube with practiced confidence. For one brief moment, everything was perfectly silent. The instant her hand touched the connection, every light inside the room blazed to life. Victoria froze. Edward's eyes opened, not slowly, not weakly, immediately. The confusion that had clouded his face for days had vanished. He looked directly at his daughter with calm, heartbreaking certainty. Before Victoria could step backward, another door hidden beside the observation room swung open. Dr. Marcus Bennett walked into the room, holding a tablet computer in one hand, his expression composed and unwavering. Behind him came hospital executives, legal counsel, and investigators, each witnessing the moment that would change every life inside that room forever. Victoria's confident expression disappeared. For the first time since her plan began, fear replaced certainty. Victoria's lips trembled as she instinctively stepped away from the ventilator. "Dad, I was only checking the machine," she stammered, forcing the same gentle smile that had convinced reporters for weeks. No one answered. Marcus Bennett calmly unlocked the tablet in his hand. "You've told that story before," he said evenly. "This time, the evidence tells a different one." He tapped the screen. The first video began playing. Recorded from the independently installed security system, it showed Victoria entering the room only moments earlier, looking into the hallway, putting on medical gloves, and reaching directly toward the ventilator connection. The recording continued uninterrupted until the room lights came on. Victoria's face turned pale. "That's fake," she whispered. Marcus looked at her without anger. "It isn't the only evidence." He swiped to the next file. A detailed ventilator event log appeared, showing the exact second the breathing circuit had been disconnected. Another screen displayed the recovered server records, identifying unauthorized deletion of surveillance data following the first incident. The timestamps matched perfectly. Jonathan Pierce quietly placed printed copies of the reports on a nearby table. Then Marcus opened another file. Emily Carter's recorded witness statement filled the screen as the young nurse described seeing Victoria standing beside the medical equipment moments before the original emergency. Her voice shook, but every detail remained consistent. Finally, Marcus displayed the independent forensic analysis comparing the electronic records, server activity, and ventilator data. Each document supported the next. Each missing piece now fit together. The room fell completely silent. Victoria slowly looked around, hoping someone would defend her. No one did. Edward Ashford drew a slow breath before speaking for the first time. "I gave you every opportunity to choose compassion over greed." His voice remained gentle, but every word carried the weight of a father whose heart had been broken. "You weren't trapped by poverty. You weren't abandoned. You had every advantage I never did." Victoria lowered her eyes. "I was afraid of losing everything," she murmured. Edward shook his head. "No." He looked at her sadly. "You were afraid of waiting." At that moment, Detective Laura Mitchell entered the room, a 49-year-old investigator with short auburn hair, steady green eyes, and a composed demeanor shaped by more than 2 decades in the New York Police Department. She had earned a reputation for letting evidence, not emotion, guide every decision. After reviewing the materials collected during the investigation, she gave a quiet nod to the officers standing behind her. "Victoria Ashford," she said calmly, "you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder, destruction of evidence, and making false statements during a criminal investigation." One officer gently secured the handcuffs around Victoria's wrists. She offered no resistance. As she was escorted toward the door, she looked back one final time. Edward's eyes filled with tears. "I forgive you because you're my daughter," he said softly. "But forgiveness is mine to give." He paused. "Justice belongs to the law." Without another word, the officers led Victoria into the corridor, while Marcus quietly lowered the tablet that had finally allowed the truth to speak for itself. Spring sunshine finally returned to New York, washing away the long weeks of snow and bitter rain that had once surrounded Helix Medical Center. For the first time in months, the city seemed to breathe with quiet optimism, as though justice itself had brought a new season. Several weeks had passed since the trial concluded. Edward Ashford stood once again inside the glass headquarters of Ashford Global Holdings, looking over the Manhattan skyline from the executive boardroom he had built decades earlier. Although the 82-year-old billionaire still relied on a polished wooden cane after his recovery, his posture had regained the quiet confidence that once inspired thousands of employees. The deepest wounds left behind were no longer physical. They came from discovering that greed had nearly destroyed his own family. Reporters expected Edward's first public appearance to focus on the company, the trial, or the billions of dollars he still controlled. Instead, invitations sent to media outlets carried a different headline: "A New Beginning for American Healthcare." Among the invited guests was Dr. Marcus Bennett. Marcus arrived wearing a simple navy suit rather than his familiar white physician's coat. Tall, composed, and carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined him throughout the investigation, he seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention now surrounding him. After weeks of legal review, Helix Medical Center had formally restored his medical license, publicly apologized, and acknowledged that his actions had saved Edward's life while exposing a deliberate crime. Hospital executives, physicians, nurses, and community leaders gradually filled the auditorium. Many had once questioned Marcus. Today, they rose from their seats to greet him with respectful handshakes, recognizing not only his courage but also his refusal to abandon the truth when doing so cost him nearly everything. As the lights dimmed and cameras prepared to broadcast the event nationwide, Edward stepped onto the stage alone. He looked across the audience for several quiet seconds before smiling toward Marcus, who remained seated in the front row. "Today," Edward began, "is not about celebrating what I survived." He paused. "It's about honoring the people who refuse to surrender their conscience even when the price is their reputation." The room fell silent as every camera slowly turned from the billionaire toward the doctor whose greatest victory had never been proving himself innocent, but proving that integrity could still overcome fear. Edward slowly stepped down from the stage instead of remaining behind the podium. The audience watched in silence as the elderly billionaire crossed the polished floor and stopped directly in front of Marcus Bennett. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then Edward extended his hand. "Doctor," he said with a warm smile, "would you stand beside me?" Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. He had never sought recognition. Saving lives had always mattered more to him than applause. Nevertheless, he accepted Edward's invitation and walked onto the stage as hundreds of guests rose to their feet. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. When the room finally grew quiet again, a large screen behind them illuminated with a new name, the Guardian Care Foundation. Edward looked toward the audience. "My daughter wanted an inheritance measured in dollars," he said softly. "I have decided my true legacy will be measured in lives." Another round of applause echoed throughout the auditorium. He continued, "Today I am committing the first $500 million to establish this foundation. Its mission is simple." The screen changed to display 3 statements. Protect healthcare professionals who courageously report corruption and wrongdoing. Provide medical assistance to elderly patients who cannot afford life-saving treatment. Help hospitals strengthen ethical training, transparency, and patient protection so that no family experiences what mine did. Edward then turned toward Marcus. "I asked this remarkable physician to become the foundation's co-founder and executive director." Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "I never expected this." Edward smiled. "I know, that's exactly why you're the right person." Laughter and applause filled the room. Marcus stepped to the microphone. "I accept this responsibility," he said, "not because of what happened to me, but because no nurse, doctor, patient, or family should ever have to choose between doing the right thing and protecting their future." Across the auditorium, many hospital employees quietly wiped away tears. Emily Carter smiled proudly from the 3rd row. Ryan Collins exchanged a grateful nod with Jonathan Pierce. Even Evelyn Brooks, who had once been forced to suspend Marcus under enormous pressure, stood and applauded with visible emotion. Dozens of television cameras no longer focused on Edward Ashford. Instead, they followed Marcus Bennett. Only weeks earlier, those same cameras had broadcast accusations questioning his integrity. Today, they captured something entirely different. A physician whose reputation had been restored not through anger or revenge, but through patience, truth, and unwavering character. As the ceremony concluded, Edward placed one hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Marcus smiled. "No, sir. We saved something much bigger." Edward looked across the audience where young medical students, experienced physicians, and community volunteers stood together applauding. The belief, Marcus continued, that doing the right thing is still worth the cost. For several long moments, no one spoke. The standing ovation said everything words no longer could. Edward approached once more, leaning lightly on his cane. "When I was a young man," he said, "I believed the greatest success was building a fortune." Marcus looked toward him. "And now?" Edward smiled. "Now I know the greatest success is leaving behind something that continues helping people after you're gone." News outlets across the country covered the event, but the headlines surprised many viewers. They were not about Edward Ashford's billions. They were not about the sensational trial. Instead, they celebrated the physician who had refused to compromise his principles, even when his career, reputation, and future seemed lost. Before leaving the stage, Edward turned toward the audience one final time. "Every generation inherits something," he said. "Money disappears, buildings grow old, companies change, but courage becomes someone else's strength." He extended his hand to Marcus once again. The 2 men shook hands as the audience rose for one final standing ovation. For Marcus Bennett, the applause was never the reward. The real reward was knowing that somewhere in America, another doctor would one day choose honesty over silence because this story had shown that truth could prevail. And for Edward Ashford, the greatest inheritance he would ever leave behind was no longer written in a will. It lived in every patient protected, every healthcare worker defended, and every life changed by a foundation born from one act of courage. As the lights dimmed and the cameras slowly faded away, the name the Guardian Care Foundation remained glowing above the stage. A quiet reminder that while greed may leave scars, integrity leaves a legacy that time cannot erase.